Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth of five webinars on Medicare drug payments and how it impacts you, the life science company. I am Pedro Salameo, founder and CEO of Definitive Health Partners.
And I'm John Warren, owner of Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting.
Welcome back, John. Let's dive right into it. So for this webinar, we will be discussing strategies that you, the life science company, should take when making your case to CMS. In other words, do not show up fashionably late to the party. John, as a former Medicare officer, you noticed a number of manufacturers used to look at Medicare coverage as an afterthought to the FDA approval process, but you have a simple message for these companies, don't you?
I do, Pedro, and that message really is plan ahead. There's really no playbook for manufacturers to use when approaching CMS. In today's session, we're going to explain what we believe manufacturers need to do and need to think about when planning their overall approach to coming to the agency to talk about reimbursing new products. Now, the first step to this process is really becoming familiar with the playing field, in this case, CMS. And what we have here is the most recent CMS organization chart. And we've talked about this in prior episodes, but I think here you can really see just how hierarchical the agency is. Each of the boxes on this chart has its own responsibility, its own priorities, and its own staff. And oftentimes they don't interact with one another. For instance, the Centers for Clinical Standards and Quality is responsible for coverage decisions at both the national and local level. The Center for Medicare is responsible for payment policy. They run the coding systems and they set rates for most services paid under traditional Medicare. And the Center for Medicaid and CHIP Services runs the Medicaid program. So three different organizations, three different sets of responsibilities. But looking at the big picture, it should really become clear that as an organization, you've got to make sure that you're talking to the right group of people. And in some cases, these conversations might require multiple touch points. And that's because talking to one group doesn't always mean that other groups hear the same message.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. I know you and I have worked with a number of companies in this process, and really the sweet spot we've found is really 15 months prior to the PDUFA date. So typically the end of phase three to start these initial conversations. We've also worked with companies that have waited a bit of time, even a year, and sometimes you would think a year is enough, but sometimes it's a tight timeline. So, John, let's talk about Medicare coverage and the process and how it works. How do companies get started with that?
Yeah, so this is really important because oftentimes coverage is the first step in a product's commercialization journey, particularly with Medicare. So what we have on this chart is our sort of graphic depiction of the national coverage process, and you can see along the top, this is about a 9-month process. It wouldn't be unusual for it to go a little bit longer than that. So it's important that that 15-month sort of time frame that we've talked about becomes very critical in this process because there is a lot of close and intensive communication with the coverage group at CMS to ensure that you are able to present your value propositions and your messaging to CMS. A couple of the touch points that I want to point out in this process for stakeholders, really the first is the preliminary discussion process. This is the first opportunity that a manufacturer will have to formally or informally, in this case, socialize CMS to the product, explain what it is and how it works. Beyond that, you'll have the opportunity to submit a formal NCD request where you'll provide the clinical dossier of evidence supporting your product's request for coverage. And then finally, once CMS has reviewed the dossier and done their analysis, you'll have an opportunity to provide comments on the draft NCD or the national coverage determination and give additional feedback to CMS. That's the national process. But if we shift gears to talk about the local process, keep in mind that CMS only creates a handful, in fact, a small handful of national policies every year, somewhere between 4 and maybe 7 or so. And that's really where this local coverage process steps in to fill some of the void. Again, we've got our representation of the process, but note there's no overall timeline associated with this process, unlike the national process. There are, however, several opportunities to interact with contractors during the process. The first two of those are the informal meeting process with the MAC, again, giving you the opportunity to socialize the contractor to your product, and then giving you the opportunity to formally request a local coverage decision by submitting a dossier. Once the Medicare contractor has done their analysis, you and other stakeholders will have the opportunity to provide comments on that LCD, tell CMS's contractors where they got it right or maybe where they missed the mark. And then finally, an open meeting is held that allows for additional comment and additional feedback to the process. So it's really important, though, to keep in mind that whether we're talking about a national coverage decision or a local coverage decision, those decisions are made on clinical information, and that information's got to be sound and credible. Not fully understanding that can really lead to some devastating consequences. Let's take, for instance, the Aduhelm example. Now, this drug was highly touted as a treatment for Alzheimer's, but today it finds itself in a place of having very limited coverage from CMS. The company's had to reduce the selling price of the product and has even engaged in some staff reductions because of this. Now, of course, I don't know all of the details about what happened behind the scenes in this process, but I can tell you that having the right advisors who can understand this process, understand what CMS is going to look for and what's going to resonate with them is very important. And the Aduhelm example should be a cautionary tale to drug makers everywhere.
So, John, you have me thinking, what if I'm the life science company and I'm approaching CMS, what are the triggers that decide a local versus national coverage? And then, you know, you can go for national coverage, but what are the risks or what's the risk involved with either coverage?
Yeah, one of the primary distinctions between national and local coverage, to an extent, is really the level of evidence that a manufacturer needs to provide in order to support coverage. For instance, national coverage decisions are generally made by CMS looking for the highest level of evidence available. They're going to want to see where they're feasible, a randomized clinical trial. They're going to want to see published literature in peer-reviewed journals, and so on. While the contractors will also look for that information when they create a local policy, they have less restrictions on them. They can use additional information. They can perhaps use retrospective studies or other evidence needed to support the information. So it's really important to keep that in mind when making this decision. And the biggest risk to seeking a national coverage decision for a lot of my clients has been the risk of a national non-coverage decision. If CMS nationally decides to non-cover an item or service, that's a showstopper. There's no way that a local contractor can then subsequently say, yes, but we're going to cover it.
Wow. Yeah, that's great insight, John. If we move on to some of the keys to success, specifically from a coding and pricing perspective, can you give a little bit more color commentary around that process?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up because I think in a lot of these webinars, we've been focusing a lot on coverage because
Mhm.
that's a very important part of this process. But coding and pricing are equally important. And both of these processes have been improved over the years. Let's look at the coding process for starts. Over the past couple of years, CMS has really taken to heart the need to react quickly from a coding perspective. And for drugs and biologicals now, CMS is issuing codes on a quarterly basis. That gives stakeholders the opportunity 4 times a year to interact with the agency to request new codes or revisions to codes. Now, the trade off for this increased speed came at the cost of the public meeting for drugs and biological coding. That public meeting's no longer held, but I think the increase in speed has been more than offset, I should say, that reduction in transparency. And similarly, prices for Part B drugs are updated on a quarterly basis as well. So that's a very nimble process that can react very quickly to changes in the market. That's a little different for Part D, I should say, because those drug prices are set annually. But recall, going back to the beginning of the session, coding and payment are even managed by 2 different organizations within CM, or the Center for Medicare. And with these rapid turnaround processes, these quarterly processes, it becomes more important than ever to come prepared to CMS to meet with the right people and have the right messages available. Let me give you an example. If you try to have, for instance, a pricing communication or a pricing discussion, I should say, with the coding staff, that discussion is going to fall on deaf ears. Now, like I said, CMS tries to get the right people to the right meetings, but that doesn't always work out. So it's important for you as a stakeholder to be bringing the right message to the right people.
Right. Yeah. When I think about our clients, John, they are in general they think upon this favorably in terms of the speed now at which they can attain codes. Before it was just January and 1 year time frame. So they're appreciative of that. And they are just now realizing the speed. To your point, you don't have a lot of time to prepare, to make sure that you're having these discussions quick enough. And we've seen a number of clients have to delay it an extra quarter because they just weren't prepared, because this timeline has increased. John, what does a company need if you're going to develop a pill or an injection, right? Those are different potential, or even site of care, different types of codes that you may need.
Yeah, the real important question there for stakeholders is, how is my drug going to be paid? Right. So if the drug's injected or infused, it's most likely going to be a Part B drug. And in those cases, you have to decide whether or not you'll need a formal coverage decision from CMS. What data is going to support it? Do you have the data to support it? What does the coding landscape look like for the product? And is there a coding solution that's available? Or are you going to need to create a new pathway? And last but not least, is pricing going to be favorable enough to successfully launch the product? That's three different interactions with three different messages to three different groups within CMS. And I can't really understate how important it is to have someone help you navigate through this process, to help you to de-risk this process as much as you can.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, John. We did develop a case study here you can see on the screen. This is a real world example of one of our clients. We have de-identified that client, but you can see mid-sized company, very competitive oncology space, infusion therapy. So you're potentially falling under a medical or a pharmacy benefit based on the payer research that we conducted. But John, can you talk a little bit about the key insights that we learned, or the company
Yeah,
learned?
this is a great case study. In this case, the one thing that, well, the company did a lot of things right, but one of the things that they did, that really resonated with me, is they came to us early. They came to us during the very end of their pre-launch period. They were nearing the end of phase 3. The evidence was looking very good, and they felt confident in interacting with us early in that process. And we were able to stay with them and work with them through the entire launch phase. Taking all of that information that we learned from the client about their product and blending that with what we knew about how CMS worked, how the coverage process worked, how the coding process worked, and so on, we were able to create for them a really comprehensive survey of what the payer landscape looked like. We were able to show them who's covering the product, where is it being covered, what are the restrictions maybe that Medicare has in place or could possibly put in place for coverage of the product, what were the coding solutions that were available, and what were the implications to payment rates based on those coding solutions. And at the end of the day, I think we were successful with this company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know the company was very happy with us. To me, the key takeaways of this slide are on the right-hand side, where you see the reduction in the number of CMS interactions required, just the time they were able to reduce the time spent interacting with CMS, and just this whole process from a project management perspective. And just because of that, it resulted in a reduction in overall spend on the project that they reinvested in another project as well. So, John, I want to thank you for your time here, and I want to thank everyone who attended the webinar. Hopefully, these were very informative. We have one webinar left, and this one arguably is very important for your future strategy. It is a look forward. What does Medicare look like in the next couple years? Based on our experience, it's to us with pricing regulations, it's not a matter if, but more when. In fact, the last 5 administrations, Democratic or Republican, have all had regulations or bills that they've tried to pass around drug pricing. So this would be really, really an interesting conversation that we'll have. In the meantime, we would love to work with you or have a discussion with you on any kind of needs that you may have, and from a market access, specifically a Medicare perspective. So here's our contact information, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Take care.